Thank you for watching Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Putnam. I am thankful to all news resources and my entire team. Following news have been reported by American, European, Canadian, Asian, African, Australian channels and also news agencies AFP, AP and Reuters. Now the headlines. Future of non-compete agreement in United States. Protest in London and in United States for ceasefire in Gaza. Protest in Israel for removing the Netanyahu government. New video release of hostages. Violence is spreading in Ecuador. A book on climate change. Encampment in American schools for ceasefire in Gaza. Israel killed 13 people in Gaza yesterday. Tornado outbreak in America. Meeting in Saudi Arabia for Gaza ceasefire. Spanish Prime Minister's supporters. Freedom of speech and Gaza protest in university campuses. Now the news headlines. Rather details.
From viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm John Yang. Today, some universities moved to shut down protests over the Israel-Hamas war as students at other schools dug in and vowed to keep their demonstrations going. In Northeastern University in Boston, officers in riot gear cleared an encampment without incident and arrested more than 100 protesters for trespassing and disorderly conduct. School officials said what they called professional organizers had infiltrated the demonstration and that anti-Semitic slurs had been used. Students disputed all that and said the slurs came from what they called counter-protesters. At other schools, including the University of Pittsburgh, students said they intended to keep their peaceful demonstrations going at least until Monday. At Columbia University, students pressed their demand that the school divest from corporations and institutions they say support Israel.
You have the power to end this tomorrow. And the things that we need from you as students is real, intentional commitment to the demands we have placed on the table.
Late Friday, Columbia's policymaking body voted to investigate the school administration, saying students' rights had been violated. And Columbia banned a student protester from campus for anti-Semitic comments he made in an online video. The student has since said he was wrong. In the Israel-Hamas war, Israeli airstrikes on southern Gaza have killed at least 13 people, 4 of them children. A separate strike in a central Gaza refugee camp killed 5 people. Israel says Hamas uses residential areas to shield militants. Efforts continue for a hostage and ceasefire deal with Hamas in order to avert a promised Israeli ground invasion of Rafah. Residents in parts of Nebraska and Iowa are sifting through the aftermath of a tornado outbreak. Videos posted on social media show twisters churning up debris on Friday as they crossed fields, highways, and towns. There were reports of several injuries, but no deaths. There's a threat of tornadoes again tonight in Nebraska, as well as in Texas and Oklahoma. And disgraced movie producer Harvey Weinstein is in a New York City hospital tonight for tests. Weinstein, whose sex abuse case helped kick off the Me Too movement, had been sent to Rikers Island in New York City from his upstate prison ahead of a court appearance. His 2020 rape conviction in New York was tossed out this week by an appeals court and a new trial ordered. His conviction in a similar case in California still stands. Still to come on PBS News Weekend, why once peaceful Ecuador is now a center of drug-fueled violence. And a new book investigates the landscape of climate change from A to Z.
This is PBS News Weekend from WETA Studios in Washington, home of the PBS NewsHour, weeknights on PBS.
This week, the Federal Trade Commission voted to bar companies from using what are called non-compete agreements to keep employees from taking new jobs with competitors or starting competing businesses. The FTC estimates that 30 million Americans, or about 1 in 5 workers, are covered by these restrictions, and they range from CEOs to hourly workers. The day after the vote, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other business groups went to court. They're trying to block the new rule before it's to take effect in August. Taylor Giorno is the business and lobbying reporter for The Hill, which covers politics and policy. Taylor, why is the FTC, or why did the FTC say they're taking this step?
Yeah, so the FTC first announced that it was going to propose a rule basically banning all existing and future non-compete agreements back in January 2023. And they said that they were taking this step because it was under Section 5 of their mandate to basically take action on exploitative or exclusionary practices by businesses. So this is the lesson on this. So it'll be a very interesting challenge of federal versus state power to see which way the courts decide to lean.
Taylor Giorno of The Hill, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
It wasn't that long ago that Ecuador was a beacon of stability in a region known for political unrest and drug trafficking. But it's become one of Latin America's most violent countries, with increasing violence and murders. As Ali Rogan reports, many Ecuadorians are turning to their young political outsider president to turn things around.
Ecuador is in a state of war. That was what 36-year-old President Daniel Noboa said in January as he declared a state of internal armed conflict against his country's drug cartels. In the past year, the small South American nation saw the assassination of a presidential candidate, the escape of numerous gang members from prison, including the leader of one of the country's most powerful drug cartels, and a brazen armed takeover of a local TV station during a live broadcast.
Related to drugs, I'm afraid that we will continue to see the violence that Latin America has seen for 4 or 5 decades now.
Carolina Jimenez Sandoval, the president of the Washington office on Latin America, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This week, the Biden administration finalized new rules ordering power companies to slash greenhouse gas emissions from coal-burning plants. Data shows that global levels of the 3 main heat-trapping greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, all reached record highs in 2023 for the second year in a row. And experts say there's no end in sight. But a new book says there is reason for hope. William Brangham spoke with its author.
Climate change from A to Z. That is the premise of a new collection of 26 essays, one for each letter of the alphabet, like C for capitalism, or K for kilowatt, Q for quagmire. Journalist and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Elizabeth Kolbert wrote the words, artist Wesley Alsbrook did the illustrations, and together they delve into everything from the history change from A to Z. Elizabeth Kolbert, great to talk to you again. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And that is PBS News Weekend for this Saturday. I'm John Yang. For all of my colleagues, thanks for joining us. See you tomorrow.
On this Saturday night, on-campus protests escalate. The pro-Palestinian movement sweeping U.S. universities and growing globally. Protest and counter-protest in London. Plus, the clashes and the crackdowns on student encampments.
As a member of the Jewish people, I feel my people being attacked. The headlines that we are seeing, record profits as Canadians struggle to eat.
Shunning Superstore, how Loblaw became a lightning rod for sky-high grocery prices, and the month-long movement to shake it.
That's my son's bedroom, yep.
Trail of destruction.
It's complete devastation. I can't believe this happened so fast.
Violent tornadoes rip through the U.S. Midwest, where the severe tornado-spawning storms will hit next. And wish you weren't here. How tourists are ruining the world's greatest cities.
Global National with RNSO.
A microcosm of the anger being felt around the world. 2 protests in London, England today. One by pro-Palestinian demonstrators calling for an end to the war in Gaza and facing them down. A counter-protest by supporters of Israel in its effort to destroy Hamas and bring the hostages home. Police officers on patrol to prevent any escalation. This elderly man, a Holocaust survivor, says history shows wide-scale protests against war can end hostilities.
There is a worldwide movement which is ever growing, like during the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. There is a chance of prevailing.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. Anti-war protesters are digging in and vowing to keep up their fight on post-secondary campuses. At Montreal's McGill University, students set up a small encampment today, calling for an end to the war. In the U.S., from Northeastern University in Boston to Cal Poly on the West Coast, students are refusing to scale back, and police are upping their presence, arresting protesters and dismantling encampments, as the Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, calls on President Biden to send in the National Guard. In Gaza, meanwhile, ordinary people found a simple yet powerful way to write a message of thanks on whatever semblance of a home they have left. We'll have more on their situation on the ground, but Neitha Garcha begins our coverage tonight with the campus protests that just keep growing.
In one of the latest escalations, protesters and police clashed at Ohio State University. At Northeastern University in Boston Saturday morning, officers cleared protesters from an encampment where students were standing with linked arms. And inside Cal Poly Humboldt in Northern California, graffiti-covered walls and shattered glass leading to the president's office as the standoff with students continues.
If, in fact, they have moved out of Stevens, I'm told it's an occupation.
It's still occupied.
Okay, thank you. So this is part of what we're trying to understand, right?
Institutional responses at campuses across the U.S. have varied from negotiations and dialogue with protesters to police crackdowns like at UT Austin.
This was exactly the plan. Music, food, teach-ins, educational stuff. And then they brought riot police and brought mace and brought cavalry.
At Columbia University in New York, the epicenter of the protest, a large encampment of tents in the middle of the campus remained overnight as talks with school administrators hit an impasse. Outside the gates, this exchange.
Israel should stop bombing civilian areas and accident killing the hostages. Israel did not take the hostages.
Many of the demonstrators say they're peacefully protesting, asking their universities to divest from Israeli-linked companies profiting off the war in Gaza. Those calls echoed by this Jewish band outside the Supreme Court in Washington earlier this week, as state officials and some university leaders have labeled the protests as anti-Semitic.
A lot of the protesting encampments are Jewish-led alongside Palestinians, and so we reject that fundamentally.
As a member of the Jewish people, I feel my people being attacked.
This Stanford student drawing parallels between Gaza and his family's experience during the Korean War.
Researching and learning about my own personal family history regarding the Korean War, where 20% of the DPRK population was just eliminated through a super aggressive firebombing campaign.
Columbia University has a rich history of student activism, notably during the Vietnam War era. In 1968, the campus became a focal point for anti-war protests, similar to how it is today. Neitha Garcha, Global News, Washington.
Hamas has published a video of 2 more hostages taken from their homes on October 7th. We've decided to only show you still images from that video. The men are identified as 64-year-old Keith Siegel and 46-year-old Omri Miran. It's not clear when the video was taken. Speaking under duress, both captives mentioned the Passover holiday, and they urged the Israeli government to reach a deal with Hamas. Siegel, an Israeli-American, was taken with his wife from the kibbutz. She was freed in November. Miran was taken hostage from his home in front of his wife and his 2 young daughters. Back in the U.S., devastating tornadoes carved a path of destruction across the Midwest overnight.
Oh my gosh, look at that snowflake.
Dozens of tornadoes plowed through Nebraska and Iowa on Friday, down in power lines as they crossed interstates and leveling hundreds of homes. Locals did what they could to escape, hunkering down in basements as roofs were ripped apart. The terrifying twisters packed wind speeds reaching 110 kilometers per hour. Now, incredibly, there are no reports of deaths so far.
That's my son's bedroom, yep, and I told him to go to his mom's house. Yep, and I'm glad he did.
Glad there's no fatalities in the neighborhood. I heard it's complete devastation. I can't believe this happened so fast.
We were under our kitchen and the pressure changed, your ears popped, and just an enormous amount of debris just was falling on the floor above us.
Today, locals sifted through what was left of their homes, salvaging what they could. But the risk isn't over. Tonight, there were fears of flash flooding, and a tornado watch is still in place for 55 million Americans from Michigan all the way to Texas, with forecasters warning of even more wild weather into Sunday. Disgraced movie producer Harvey Weinstein has been hospitalized following his return to New York City's Rikers Island jail. Weinstein's lawyer says the former movie mogul is undergoing several tests at Manhattan's Bellevue Hospital, adding that the 72-year-old needs a lot of help physically and is somewhat of a train wreck health-wise. Weinstein was transported back to New York on Friday ahead of a court appearance on Wednesday in relation to his overturned rape conviction last week. In this country, consumers fed up with the high cost of groceries are gearing up to send a message with their wallets. A planned boycott of Loblaw and its affiliated stores is gaining traction, while a petition calling for an investigation into the company for alleged profiteering is nearing 100,000 signatures. Abigail Beeman reports on the frustration and the planned action.
This car cost me $130 for a meal and like some snacks, basically, so I'm kind of over it.
Kind of over it. Dale Camara is like most Canadians. New Ipsos polling done exclusively for Global News found 80% of people pay more for groceries each week, the majority $50 or more.
Or $1,000 a year that people are paying more for groceries than they were this time last year.
While prices are up everywhere, Loblaw is the biggest of Canada's big five grocers. Camara heard about the grassroots movement to boycott Loblaw-owned stores for the month of May, and he's on board.
They should be making a profit like so high that it's like hard to feed us.
The subreddit Loblaws is out of control has 57,000 members and a number of demands, such as signing the Grocer Code of Conduct and no further retailer-led price increases this year.
The hope is that we can be, taking steps to reduce grocery prices for all Canadians.
Founder Emily Johnson says she's received an email from a Loblaw executive looking for a meeting, and she's hopeful, but knows not everyone can boycott when for many Canadians, a Loblaw-owned store is the only option.
Whether you think that you can avoid Loblaw stores or not, there are plenty of ways for you to get involved and, to ensure that your voice is heard, because you're not alone in any of these struggles.
There's not enough competition. If you shop around for lower prices, that behavior in and of itself actually will cause prices to drop.
Meanwhile, a petition calling for an investigation into alleged greedflation and pandemic profiteering by Loblaw is closing in on 100,000 signatures, launched by a university student and former Superstore cashier.
The headlines that we are seeing, record profits as Canadians struggle to eat. Those two are pretty tied together, I think.
Global News asked Loblaw about the petition, the boycott, and the online group's demands. In a statement, the company said it's doing what it can to combat inflation, and customers are noticing, claiming there are more visits to stores and even comments in the, quote, same Reddit groups about getting real value. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
While there are some affordable living measures in the new federal budget, the government is still grappling with the high cost of groceries. Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne told Global News last fall that he was speaking with foreign grocery chains in a bid to increase competition in the sector. But this week on the West Block, he tells our Mercedes Stevenson the availability of retail space is an issue.
I met one of them in the United States, and the biggest hurdle they had was about leases. They could not find 400 or 500 leases or property to lease in Site A in the country, despite them being very big, billions of dollars.
And you can hear more from the Industry Minister on grocery prices tomorrow morning on the West Block, right here on Global. Touched by the gift of life. Coming up, a powerful new campaign turning conversation into action in Alberta. Ontario is reportedly set to introduce tough new measures around cell phones and vaping at schools across the province. According to the Toronto Star, the measures will be among the toughest in North America and will include ways to empower teachers to follow through on the new rules. Details are said to be coming in an announcement tomorrow. Ontario's Education Minister Stephen Lecce has not confirmed the reporting, only saying in a tweet today that the province must confront the issue of cell phone distraction and vaping once and for all. Every year in Canada, there are people who desperately need life-saving organ transplants but can't get one. That wait can be excruciating, and hundreds die while they're waiting for an organ. Now, in a bid to increase organ donations and to save lives, this week the province of Alberta launched a new awareness campaign. Heather Yarts West reports.
Hearts, you're giving heart. Whether it's through a game of charades, a funny t-shirt, or with a cake, a new campaign from Give Life Alberta is encouraging viewers to make their wishes known.
I think it's fantastic. I love the fact it focuses on positive conversations about organ donation and normalizing that.
Because those conversations could become incredibly important. Kinza Barney came to know that firsthand.
But I'm stuck in colder weather.
We were just kind of driving and practicing for his road test, and out of the blue he asked me that question. Are you a donor?
The conversation ended with Kinza's son Zach telling his mom he wanted to be a donor too.
Again with the silly faces. The silly faces.
A few weeks later, a tragic accident would take the teenager's life.
So I feel very, very fortunate that we had the opportunity to have that conversation. It made it his decision at the end of the day.
There are about 4,000 Canadians on the transplant waiting list, and it's a pretty agonizing wait.
Even though a single organ donor can save up to 8 lives, every year in Canada, hundreds on that waiting list will die. It's why there are questions about whether Canada should change its approach. In most provinces, donation is only possible if a person opts in to become a donor. But in 2021, Nova Scotia became the first jurisdiction in Canada where the willingness to donate is assumed unless the person opts out. New Brunswick has since adopted this policy too, joining Spain, a country that has followed an opt-out model for more than 40 years.
What we see is the number of individuals who, as a percentage of population, who are having their needs met when it comes to organ transplantation is significantly higher than a country like Canada.
And I think this is one of his first Oilers jerseys.
Zach's gift ultimately saved 5 people, including a young father of 2.
Even though he isn't physically here with us anymore, I can see him living on in others.
Turning tragedy into a beautiful legacy of life and love. Heather Yarts West, Global News, Airdrie, Alberta.
Ahead ahead, the silent threat lurking beneath the surface and endangering the heart of Manitoba's summer playground. Residents and businesses in Winnipeg's cottage country are worried that Parks Canada will close access to a popular lake this spring and summer, and it's in response to zebra mussels, an invasive species that are now apparently the farthest west they've reached in Canada. Melissa Ridgeon reports.
When the ice is gone in a few weeks, Clear Lake should be bustling with boats, canoes, kayaks, and swimmers. But threatening that, zebra mussels. Invaders from the Black Sea who came to Canada on cargo ships nearly 40 years ago and continue their westward spread.
It started spreading around the Great Lakes within Lake Erie, and then there's ships moving from port to port to port, bringing them to the other lakes. It escaped out of the Great Lakes into the Mississippi River drainage, and so now it's in hundreds and hundreds of lakes, mostly in eastern North America and the eastern United States. So then it started spreading westward, and it got into the Red River drainage, and then it looks like it came in through the Red River. The Clear Lake would be the most westward place in Canada. Mollusks were reported at a boat launch in Clear Lake last fall, despite a rigorous monitoring and prevention program. But water tests this winter were negative for their DNA, though experts warn they could still be present. And without natural predators, this is what they can do. Manitoba Hydro is battling infestations at several generating stations elsewhere in the province. Once the horse gets out of the barn, once they start invading more and more lakes, it's just really challenging at that point to contain them. So Parks Canada is considering closing Clear Lake to watercraft this summer and even inflatable water toys.
The rumblings of a complete watercraft ban are a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, and we are asking for a look at a long-term solution.
Residents want beefed up prevention, but so far, silence from Parks Canada, which declined to be interviewed. This expert says a potash treatment at the boat launch area could kill zebra mussels, if any remain, but that won't prevent more from coming in. Our recommendation would be to limit boats or restrict them until they've done the treatment. And at least they have some degree of certainty that they've eradicated the mussels, and then reassess. Ashley Smith's ancestors lived, hunted, and fished here long before it was a national park. The business owner has little faith in the federal government's ability to manage the issue.
There's lack of communication. I expressed to Parks Canada that the information isn't getting out to communities.
Those living and working here hope to be part of a plan to protect the water. So far, though, they're feeling left in the dark. Melissa Ridgeon, Global News, Riding Mountain National Park, Manitoba.
Next, is your favorite vacation spot being loved too much? Over tourism and how besieged cities are fighting back. Visiting one of Quebec's most popular tourist attractions is about to get more expensive. Starting on Wednesday, all those staying on the province's famed Magdalen Islands for more than 24 hours will have to fork over an extra $30 visitor fee or face a $1,000 fine. The island's mayor says tourists have been burdening local services and revenue, with the new funds being aimed at helping bolster infrastructure, environmental protections, and waste management. The archipelago northeast of PEI has a population of roughly 13,000, but welcomed about 5 times that many visitors between May and October of 2023. Heading to Europe, you might have to pay up too. With 2024 forecast to be a record-breaking year for air travel, some of the world's most popular tourist destinations are introducing similar tactics. Redmond Shannon takes us to Venice, where, in a global first, day trippers began being charged for their visits this week.
Venetian guards not warding off Ottoman invaders, but checking QR codes to get a handle on the huge number of tourists who come to the city.
This system is very important because we are finding a new balance between the residents, the community, and the day trippers.
On certain peak days, visitors to Venice who are not staying the night will have to pay about $7 to enter the historic centre.
When you see how crowded it is today in a national holiday, yeah, you could expect something like this.
I mean, c'est la vie, it's life.
The city has already banned large cruise ships. Tens of thousands of foreigners visit daily and are unlikely to argue the fee because they've come this far. Italian visitors, however, many Venetians themselves are outraged. On the first day of the new trial, some of the city's dwindling permanent population made themselves heard. This will do nothing to stop over-tourism, says this woman. Residents who felt their city was becoming a theme park say this initiative only brings that closer.
Over-tourism is a growing problem across the world. Residents in some of the most popular spots are fighting back in different ways.
Amsterdam increased its hotel tax for foreigners this year. The Acropolis in Athens is capping daily visitor numbers. And a picturesque town in Austria even briefly erected a fence last year to deter swarms of selfie takers. In Spain's Canary Islands, locals say they've been squeezed out of the rental market and that their environment is under threat, some even going on hunger strikes to protest a new hotel project. But these islands and places like Venice rely heavily on tourist dollars. Finding the balance is not easy. France is also trying to do so, encouraging tourists to avoid peak season or to visit its lesser-known sites. A possible solution to over-tourism that asks us all to not just follow the crowd. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
And that's Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Farah Nasser.
Oh, this is an epic event. I hope we break the world record. This is just awesome.
Tonight's Air Canada is Drumheller, Alberta, the dinosaur capital of the world, and rightly so. From a Tyrannosaurus to a Triceratops, today the town's downtown core transformed into a prehistoric paradise. As you heard, the town made an attempt to set a new world record for the largest gathering of people dressed like dinosaurs. And it looks like a success. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Have a good night.
Hamas releases a video of hostages pleading with the Israeli authorities to agree to a ceasefire that will secure their release. Protesters in Israel, meanwhile, also pushing for a truce deal, increasing pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu's government. Thousands of people turn out in support of the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez. He's set to announce whether or not he'll resign following what he called a smear campaign against his wife, who's accused of corruption. And the Olympic flame embarks on its epic voyage from Greece to France across the Mediterranean. We'll be taking a closer look at the 19th century sailboat that will be its home during the 11-day voyage. You're watching France 24, I'm Alexander Alcott. Now, Israel's foreign minister has said that a planned incursion into the southern Gaza city of Rafah, where almost half the population are seeking shelter, could be suspended should a deal emerge to secure the release of Israeli hostages. Hamas said it is studying Israel's counter-proposal for a ceasefire right now, as its armed wing released a video of 2 men held hostage. They're seen urging the Israeli authorities to agree to a deal. Protesters within Israel itself, meanwhile, have also been putting pressure on the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. They accuse him of prioritising the military operations against Hamas over bringing their loved ones home.
A Passover table covered in red, here at Hostages Square in Tel Aviv. According to these Israelis, it symbolises the blood on the government's hands. Many protesting in the square accused authorities of not doing enough to bring the hostages taken by Hamas home.
The government, which abandoned Matan and many others on October 7, is hardening its heart. For what? Prime Minister Netanyahu, I am turning to you. There is no chair in the world that is worth the life of my son Matan and the lives of 132 other abductees.
On Saturday, Hamas released this video of 2 Israeli hostages held in Gaza. The men were identified by the Hostages and Missing Families Forum as Keith Siegel, aged 64, and Omri Moran, aged 47. Moran said that the situation was difficult and that there were many bombs. He claimed to be speaking on day 202 of captivity. The video was released 204 days into the war. His father was at the rally in Tel Aviv when the video was released, breaking down in tears. He later gathered the strength to speak as protesters chanted in support of him.
From this stage, I appeal to all the Israeli decision makers, including Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Approve a deal and bring the hostages back. For once, just once, show leadership.
I demand that the leaders of this country watch this video and see their own father crying out for help.
In the video, where the men appear to speak under duress, they appeal to the Israeli government to agree a deal with Hamas for a truce that would see the captives freed. It comes as Hamas said it was studying the latest Israeli counter-proposal for a Gaza ceasefire and the release of the hostages. Qatar, the US and Egypt have been attempting to secure a new ceasefire deal since a 1-week pause in the fighting in November saw the release of 80 Israeli hostages in exchange for 240 Palestinians held in Israeli prisons.
The construction of a temporary floating pier off Gaza is well underway. This Saturday, a British Royal Navy ship set sail for Cyprus to assist in the construction. The Cardigan Bay will be housing hundreds of US troops that are building the jetty, due to be completed early next month. Once it's fully operational, around 150 truckloads of aid will be delivered each day from that location. Israel says it will allow aid groups to use the pier once the deliveries are pre-screened in Cyprus. Columbia University students who inspired pro-Palestinian demonstrations have dug in for their 11th day ahead of a graduation set for next month. Protesters at New York campus and universities across the country are demanding that schools cut financial ties with Israel, as well as companies they see as complicit in enabling the conflict. The wave of protests also piles political pressure on Joe Biden, who's been criticised for his support of Israel.
Tents are still standing strong at the main lawn of Columbia University, the epicenter of the student protest movement. Negotiations with the school have been underway since Friday, but its student group says talks have hit an impasse.
At the heart of this action, at the heart of this encampment, is the wish for a complete divestment and boycott of institutions that are complicit in Israel's genocide. Despite this, the university has proposed only further engagement with the apartheid state.
Last Thursday, Columbia summoned NYPD to dismantle the mobilizations, a decision that sparked a wildfire of protests at colleges across the country. Hundreds have been arrested at numerous universities since. What started with just a few dozen protesters transforming into a nationwide movement, from NYU, Emory University and Yale, spreading all the way to the West Coast.
We're here once again, fighting for demands for divestment for justice for the Palestinian people and for safety of the Palestinian students in Stanford and Ralston.
The protesters are demanding their schools to cut financial ties to Israel and divest from companies they say are enabling the conflict. And the movement shows no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Students say they won't stop until their voices are heard.
We're heading down from New York to Washington, D.C., where the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner has now drawn to a close, as we can see there. President Joe Biden and various other senior officials, along with a few celebrities, were there, along with the gathered press, who traditionally will jibe and roast the president. Well, the White House reporters had to walk a gauntlet even before they entered it, as the pro-Palestinian protesters were hurling insults and insulting them as they were entering with their black ties and ball gowns. They were saying that by attending the event, the press was complicit with Joe Biden's support of Israel, that they described as a genocide in the Gaza Strip. Now, Russia's relentless missile strikes on Ukraine and its energy infrastructure have continued, with 4 power plants being damaged on Saturday. The bombings have led to ever more urgent calls by President Zelensky for his Western allies to provide more air defense systems. As it stands, Kyiv said its air force was still able to shoot down 21 of the 34 incoming missiles. Now for a look at the Spanish capital, where thousands of people earlier turned out to show their support for the socialist Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. Earlier in this week, he made the shock announcement that he was clearing his schedule as he was making up his mind about whether or not to resign, following what he described as a smear campaign against his wife, who's been accused of corruption. Our correspondent in Madrid, Sarah Morris, has more details.
There was a lot of support. A lot of people had even printed T-shirts saying things like Pedro stay, and yes, it's worth it. Those people, 12,500 according to the government, were basically responding to that letter that Pedro Sanchez put out on Twitter, in which he said that he felt that there was a right-wing conspiracy against him, basically attacking him and his wife. And that was basically after that court opened that investigation into Begoña Gomez, his wife, an investigation that Pedro Sanchez says is based on, in some cases, news reports that have no basis in reality. And he says they strongly contest them. His wife has done nothing illegal, and essentially those news reports claim that Gomez could have met with businesses when she had a role heading up a foundation that was based at a business university, and that later some of those businesses received government contracts, including a bailout to the airline Air Europa. Now the supporters today said that this has gone far enough, that those charges have been dismissed by the Conflict of Interest Office twice, and that they see that the right-wing and conservative parties simply don't want to accept that although the People's Party won the July elections, came out top, it couldn't form a government. And the people today in the streets telling Pedro Sanchez that on Monday he should not resign, that he should stay in the Moncloa Palace.
Sarah Morris reporting from Madrid. Now we move on to South Africa, which is marking 30 years since the end of apartheid, when the inaugural democratic elections were held. Celebrations are being overshadowed by growing anger at the current government. Analysts saying the ANC, once led by Nelson Mandela, may lose its parliamentary majority for the first time.
Pomp and ceremony 30 years after South Africa ended apartheid and ushered in an era of democracy. Cyril Ramaphosa presided over the celebration as both South African president and leader of the African National Congress, the party that's held power since elections were first held in 1994.
That we have been able to cast off the yoke of oppression and build a new nation rooted in equality, human rights, is amongst the greatest feats and achievements of modern history.
Nonki Kunene remembers casting her first ballot as an equal South African citizen 3 decades ago. She lives in Soweto and has fond memories of that day.
Even at the school where I voted, there has been a lot of changes. So I'm happy even though my heart is at pain with all that's happening lately. But I'm happy and excited.
But overshadowing South Africa's Freedom Day holiday, growing anger with the government. The ANC has been in power for 30 years, but analysts say it could, for the first time in the democratic era, lose its parliamentary majority in elections scheduled for next month. That's because many first-time voters never experienced apartheid. Some are now blaming the ANC for South Africa's long list of problems, looking for hope elsewhere. The official rate of unemployment stands at 32%, the highest in the world. According to the World Bank, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world for wealth distribution.
The death toll from flooding in Kenya has risen to 70 as the East African nation was hit by weeks of heavy rainfall. Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua says the government had set aside the equivalent of $29 million for emergency relief efforts. More than 130,000 people are currently affected, with thousands of houses washed away and others flooded. And the downpours are forecast to continue throughout this weekend. The Olympic flame has now left Greece aboard a 19th century sailboat. The Belém will spend 11 days crossing the Mediterranean before docking in the southern French port city of Marseille. Charlotte Hughes has the story.
Cheers and applause for the big send-off.
C'est magique en fait. C'est magique.
After being carried to the Belém, a 19th century boat, by the Paris Olympics chief organiser, the flame left the port of Piraeus. It's a historic departure, taking place under the watchful eyes of crew members and 16 apprentice sailors, who are touched to be guardians of the flame.
It's very emotional. The whole show and ceremony is also very moving. And now the flame is finally aboard the Belém.
It's been handed to us and we'll treasure it.
At 10 a.m, the ship set sail for France. All hands were on deck. Meanwhile, the captain left the boat. Belém headed away from Greece, accompanied by dozens of boats as it began its Mediterranean crossing. Many French people flocked to the quay to watch the event.
It's a unique opportunity to see something wonderful because the boat is truly fantastic.
Seeing the Olympic flame leaving Greece to head to France is really symbolic.
On board, the first exercises came one after the other, including lifting the sail under the supervision of the commander. Now in his 8th year at the helm, he says it's a source of great pride.
I never thought that I'd be commander of the Belém even as a kid. When they told me, I said, I don't believe it. And on top of that, transporting the flame, that's incredible.
Belém will be home to the flame for the next 11 days until its arrival in Marseille on May the 8th.
That's where we end this edition. Stay tuned for more world news on France 24.
Success going forward.
This is Asia Now.
It is 11 a.m. in Singapore and Hong Kong, 8:30 in New Delhi and 10 o'clock in Jakarta. I'm Shahida Othman. At this hour, Hamas says it is studying the latest Israeli counter-proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza, a day after reports said a delegation from mediator Egypt arrived in Israel in a bid to jumpstart stalled negotiations. Voting is underway for 3 by-elections in Japan's lower house. The results are likely to determine Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's position within his party after the ruling LDP's high-profile funding scandal. And a tornado rips through southern China and kills 5 people. Extreme weather is the latest to hit Guangzhou as the city battles deadly floods with more rain forecast. Hamas says it is studying the latest Israeli counter-proposal for a potential ceasefire in Gaza. Now, after more than 200 days of war, negotiations have been deadlocked for weeks, with both sides refusing to budge. An Egyptian delegation visiting Israel has been working to restart the stalled talks to help secure an end to the conflict and free all remaining hostages. An official told Reuters that Israel had no new proposals to make, but was considering a limited truce in which 33 hostages would be released, instead of the 40 previously under discussion. Hamas had earlier asked for a permanent ceasefire, a call that Israel has repeatedly rejected. Reports say that Tel Aviv signaled it wanted to give hostage negotiations one last chance before it moves ahead with its planned ground invasion of Rafah. The city is the last refuge for around 1 million Palestinians who fled Israeli forces in northern Gaza. This, as an exclusive Reuters report suggests that in view of some U.S. officials that Israel may be violating international law. The article showcases a divide within the U.S. State Department, with some officials showing support for Israel. Israel has said it is using U.S.-supplied weapons in accordance with international humanitarian law. But Reuters says U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been told by at least 7 State Department bureaus that they don't find Israel's assurances credible or reliable. Now, this is ahead of Mr. Blinken's report to Congress next month, where he must assure lawmakers whether he finds Israel's own assurances on the matter credible. Mr. Blinken, fresh from his China trip, will be back in the Middle East next week to visit Saudi Arabia to help effort a ceasefire in Gaza. He will also discuss the release of Israeli hostages as he meets with regional partners, including Qatar. Protests, meanwhile, gathered steam in Israel on Saturday, with thousands demanding the release of the hostages and the resignation of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. Meanwhile, pro-Palestinian protests are continuing to erupt in universities across the United States, leading to the arrest of more than 700 students. And in some places, crackdowns have become especially tense. At Amir University, police officers broke up an encampment with one officer using a stun gun on a protester who was being restrained. The fresh wave of student protests was sparked by the arrest of some 100 protesters at Columbia University 2 weeks ago. And since then, tensions quickly flared up at U.S. universities that joined the ranks of Occupy Wall Street and the 1980s anti-apartheid movement. As historical comparisons abound, administrators and law enforcement have been grappling with how to rein in the revolt.
This is insane. I just saw police use unnecessary violence for peaceful protesters. I saw police knock students to the ground. Clearly, you see a bunch of arrests going on. People were pepper sprayed.
Our movement here, when they tried to clear it last week, we prevailed. If they want to once again bring NYPD or any law enforcement, we will prevail.
Police say the students were arrested for refusing to vacate campus areas and violating university rules. But the demonstrations have persisted and continue to spread. The students are calling for universities to separate themselves from any companies that are advancing Israel's military efforts in Gaza and, in some cases, from Israel itself.
We are demanding that our universities and our institutions that have financial and academic investments in the Israeli apartheid state end those connections in order to pressure Israel to stop bombing and slaughtering Palestinians.
We are demanding funding and investment transparency from the university, and that's something, again, student groups on campus have been demanding that for a very, very long time.
The turmoil has prompted schools to cancel graduation ceremonies and shut down in-person classes. But it's not just in the US. The protests have also sprouted all around the globe, including at the renowned Sciences Po University in Paris.
Mais effectivement, voir ce qui se passe aux États-Unis, maintenant en Australie, on continue et on espère que ça va prendre aussi ici en France, parce que le monde universitaire a réellement un rôle à jouer dans ce qui est en train de se passer en Palestine et dans le génocide en cours.
Parce que la jeunesse est globalement très mobilisée sur la question depuis des mois, et donc on va pas lâcher, on va continuer de mobiliser dans les jours, les semaines et les mois à venir, jusqu'à ce que cesse le génocide à Gaza de façon générale.
Voting is underway in Japan to fill 3 vacant seats in Japan's House of Representatives. Up for grabs are seats in Shimane and Nagasaki prefectures, as well as one in Tokyo, all of which were previously held by the ruling party before becoming vacant. And this, as the Liberal Democratic Party comes under intense scrutiny after some of its factions neglected to report portions of their income and reportedly accumulated slush funds. With the scandal dampening support for the LDP, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida could lose political footing if his party fails to defend its seat in the Shimane district, where its candidates have long held power. Approval ratings for Mr. Kishida's cabinet have plummeted to their lowest level since it was launched in 2021. It has fallen far below 30%, which is a threshold widely considered a danger zone for a premier. Ahead on Asia now, tornadoes rip through the U.S. Midwest, leaving a trail of destruction and several people injured. And later we'll explore the power of the Hispanic vote as the U.S. state of New Mexico prepares to hold its presidential primaries.
Oh, that smells pretty bad. That foul stuff could have been from a reusable water bottle, because earlier I sent all these to a lab.
There was quite a bit of grime on the inside of this one.
I reviewed to the owners of the bottles what's lurking inside.
I rinse it every day, so I'm quite surprised.
Are we cleaning our water bottles enough? Talking Point, tonight on CNN.
East Asia, a region steeped in history, now helping to write the future of our world. From the corridors of power to the region's most remote corners, we'll break down the news driving some of the world's largest economies and explain why it matters.
On East Asia Tonight, with me, Oteli Edwards.
A hyper-competitive job market, dimming prospects and relentless pressure fueling a search for stability.
When economic activity dips, the first to experience any adverse outcomes will be young people.
Asia's youth employment crisis, Wednesday on CNA.
A strong tornado swept through the Chinese city of Guangzhou, with Xinhua reporting at least 5 people dead and 33 others injured. It registered level 3 intensity on a scale of 5 at a nearby weather station with a maximum wind gust of 20 meters per second. The strong winds and heavy rainfall left a swathe of damage, and more than 140 factories were hit in the industrial powerhouse known for its exports. The twister adds to the damage already caused by heavy downpours, which left 4 dead and tens of thousands displaced across several cities in southern China earlier this month. Guangdong is China's most populous province with 127 million people, and according to state media, it's the worst flooding in some parts of the province since the 1950s. Total rainfall for the month already at its highest in more than 70 years for this month. Over in the U.S., dozens of tornadoes wreaked havoc in the Midwest, leveling homes and causing at least one building to collapse. The tornadoes plowed through Nebraska and Iowa through farmland, suburbs, and a city. An industrial building collapsed with 70 people inside, but all were eventually evacuated with no life-threatening injuries. Residents have begun sifting through the rubble.
We're just taking it day by day. I mean, come upstairs and see that you have no house, emerging from the basement. You know, you're home, but you're actually homeless.
I mean, things can be replaced. One of the volunteers here said actually there was stuff from this neighborhood being found in Blanco, Iowa. So I had vintage family photos that are still unaccounted for. I'd like to find those, but we're alive.
People are sweltering in the Indian state of West Bengal amid a heat wave as temperatures rose to more than 44 degrees Celsius. In the state capital of Kolkata, residents sheltered indoors to keep cool and drank juice to stay hydrated. The country's Met Department has issued a severe heat wave alert for the nation's east and south peninsula areas until the end of the month. Business and residents are feeling the heat.
Scorching heat, unbearable. What else I could say?
20 soldiers have been killed and several injured in an ammunition explosion in Cambodia. The blast occurred in an army base in Kampong Speu province to the west of the capital. And Cambodia's army said the incident was a warehouse ammunition explosion which destroyed a truck fully loaded with munitions. Now, the impact was so large that an office building and nearby barracks were destroyed. Nearby homes were also battered by the resulting explosion with broken windows. Prime Minister Hun Manet said he was deeply shocked and expressed his condolences to the families of those killed in the tragedy. Munitions accidents are not uncommon in Cambodia. The country is littered with discarded ammunition and arms from decades of civil conflict, with accidents exacerbated by frequently lax safety standards. Russia has launched another massive missile strike at Ukraine as Kyiv targeted Moscow's refineries in retaliatory attacks. Moscow strikes targeted the nation's already battered energy grid, severely damaging 4 power plants and other critical parts of the power grid. And 1 worker was hurt in Russia's latest barrage. Emergency teams battled massive blazes at several facilities in western regions, including Lviv. Poland noted that one of the missiles landed just 15 kilometers from its border. A missile also struck a hospital in Kharkiv, injuring a woman. Moscow denies targeting civilians, but insists that Kyiv's energy system is a legitimate military target. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called on his allies to supply more air defense systems to protect the country's skies. He said the Air Force shot down 21 of 34 incoming Russian missiles, but needs more help to ensure that next time it shoots down every missile and drone. While Russia ramped up its overnight attacks, Ukraine sent its drones flying in the other direction, taking aim at vital Russian oil and gas refineries. Moscow says it shot down 66 Ukrainian drones, but it remains unclear how much damage was caused by the strikes. is just a little over a month before the U.S. state of New Mexico holds Republican and Democratic presidential primaries. New Mexico has the highest percentage of Latinos of all U.S. states, and both parties are heavily courting this voter demographic ahead of November's election. William Denslow reports.
Millions of dollars are being pumped into this election campaign. Lee County in southeast New Mexico is around 60% Hispanic. Turning out the vote in areas like this could be a political goldmine.
Lee County, we have 7,000 persons that are eligible to become citizens. So when it's time to election, we just come to the streets and knock doors to find those people so they can become citizens, so they can vote.
And those votes could have a huge bearing on the presidential race. Roughly 1.4 million Latinos become eligible to vote each year and will make up roughly 15% of all eligible voters come November. That's compared to about 7.4% back in 2000.
Because of the Electoral College, it's not just the fact that Hispanics are a growing population, but that they're comprised in a lot of really key battleground states that are essentially going to be huge in deciding who wins this next election.
Nowhere in the US will this play out more prominently than in New Mexico. Over half of the population is Hispanic, and the state has elected 3 Hispanic governors in a row. Ernie Cedarbacca is the president and CEO of the Albuquerque Hispano Chamber of Commerce. He says politicians are starting to recognize the power of this demographic.
I believe in the last 5 to 6 years, I think they're realizing that there is an opportunity to have the Latino vote, that they should do everything they can to make sure they get registered. And they're doing that. Both parties are doing that.
In 2020, Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in New Mexico by 10 points. Some Republicans in the state say they need to improve their messaging.
We're splintered in so many different factions, whether it's healthcare, whether it's abortion, women's rights, things like that. I mean, we do need to coalesce and we need a message. We can't just put a cloak over this and say, it's not our problem, we're going to deal with it later, because right now our messaging is getting lost.
Nationally, immigration will be a key issue for voters in the run-up to the election. Polling suggests Latinos tend to oppose some of Donald Trump's hardline views, like building a wall on the southern border. Data also suggests the majority of Latino voters side with Democrats when it comes to the issue of reproductive rights. But the economy could be a major pull for Republicans come election day. The motivation of voters can vary greatly, but some surveys suggest Trump's pledges of greater prosperity are gaining traction. Back in 2020, Joe Biden was roughly twice as popular as Donald Trump among Latino voters. But according to a recent USA Today Suffolk University poll, Trump now has a 5-point lead amongst that demographic should there be an election rematch come November. Promising sign for the Republican Party. Rochelle Williams is working to blunt Republican hopes in New Mexico. She founded Blue CD2 in 2021 with the goal of flipping the district to Democrat in the 2022 midterms, which they did, narrowly. Experts say strong Latino support for Democrats helped prevent a so-called red wave of Republican House and Senate race wins across the country.
So this will tell us, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, what money has come into this county to fund airports.
Now Williams hopes to keep up that momentum. Her online tools aim to show voters how the party is helping people in her district.
We have work to do, and that's what we're doing, is to change the narrative here, to say what is, to support these policies of economic and social justice that are coming out of the Democratic administration.
Latino voters are a growing, diverse and increasingly prominent demographic in US politics, with the power to potentially swing this election for either candidate. William Denslow, CNA, New Mexico.
Ahead on Asia now, how Singapore is tapping into Dutch agri-tech innovations to help bolster the country's food security.
Moment disappeared. It was a awful thing to happen.
Today, rallies continue around the country with protesters demanding an end to gender-based violence.
Not one government, not one institution, not one organisation is going to be able to fix this on their own. We all need to be working together.
An ABC investigation into how systemic failures helped create one of Queensland's youngest killers. The Deputy Prime Minister reveals a further $100 million in military support for Ukraine. And more protests in Tel Aviv as families of hostages call on the Netanyahu government to secure their release. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Dan Borsha. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will join a march in Canberra this afternoon as part of a national rally against gender-based violence. Demonstrations have been held across the country following a recent spate of deaths involving women allegedly killed by men known to them. Speaking in the Victorian town of Bendigo, CEO Kate Wright, the CEO of the Centre Against Sexual Assault, told the crowd the government needs to do more.
We need to see systemic change. Our service is in demand. We worked with over 1,300 people last year, providing over 16,000 hours of counselling and support. We have a wait list for our service. Our funding model has not changed since the 1980s. It is a shame, thank you. It's a shame, and we need government to respond and listen to women's services saying what we know people who've experienced violence need.
Meanwhile, the local community of Cobram are continuing to mourn the death of 49-year-old Emma Banks, who was found dead in her home on Tuesday.
We've been hearing that this is going to be the tightest budget we've ever had. Family violence services is not the place to make cuts. Invest now for our women and invest for their children coming forward, because this is not where we can cut. Invest for all of our safety and invest for our futures.
A quote that I say a lot is, no one is angrier than a woman who follows all the rules then gets screwed over anyway. But what I also know is, no one is more afraid than a woman who is abused and then met by silence or blame from everyone around her.
Members of the government have expressed their support for the national rallies, saying that much more needs to be done.
It's absolutely clear. It's absolutely clear from the number of women who keep on losing their lives, the number of young women who led the march today, who are absolutely fed up with this pattern of behaviour. There were women at the march today, like me. We've been marching on this issue for decades and decades and decades. We've had enough. We've had enough being angry and outraged and sad and grieving for women who have lost their lives, for women who have been seriously injured, for women who are too traumatised to participate in the workplace, to participate as members of our community.
We do need to see systemic change through our institutions. Not one government, not one institution, not one organisation is going to be able to fix this on their own. We all need to be working together. And that includes reframing this from just a women's issue to be solved to a issue about addressing men's violence. I think that is one of the really clear messages coming from that male leaders, men, do need to play a role in this.
And joining us in the studio is New South Wales Women's Safety Commissioner Dr Hannah Tonkin. Thank you very much for your company. What's your reaction to these rallies that we're seeing here in Sydney yesterday, right around the nation?
It's heartening to see so many people turn out for these important rallies. They're saying enough is enough. They're sick of seeing these extremely high rates of men's violence against women. We've seen 26 women allegedly murdered already this year, and it's only April. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because so many women are experiencing violence every day across the country that we don't even hear about. And that's why people are angry.
What does it say to you that it is that bad right now?
It has been bad for a long time. It's getting the attention now that it deserves, and we need to harness this momentum to make concrete change. We have seen a spike in these horrific murders lately, and it's absolutely tragic cases. Every single murder is a tragedy. And so what we need, and we've seen in these rallies today, we need to harness that momentum to implement reforms.
And we've heard today, 1 in 5 women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime, 1 in 3 have experienced family violence or domestic violence, 1 in 2 women with disability have experienced sexual violence. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are nearly 11 times more likely to die due to assault than other women, and are 32 times more likely to be hospitalised as a result of family violence. Something is seriously wrong with our country right now, isn't it?
That's right. This is happening all over the country. It happens in all communities, happens in all suburbs, all professions. It does not discriminate. And as you said, some groups are experiencing this at even higher rates than the general population. So we definitely need to do more.
Now, I want to get to what your views are of what more needs to be done in a moment. And I think part of that is what you've spoken about in parts of the media today. And this is around young people, young boys especially, accessing pornography and also extremely misogynistic content online. In your experience, what are you seeing as the core problem here?
Well, in terms of the online environment, I do think that's a really big problem, and that's a problem for our future generation as well. Young men and boys today are having to navigate a really challenging online space. There are influencers who are propagating really problematic messages about violence against women, about disrespect for women, messages like women are the property of men. So these sorts of messages are being pushed out online, and a lot of young men and boys are seeing this regularly. And in parallel, we're seeing increasingly boys exposed to pornography at the age of 11 or 12. And so they're having to navigate this right at that time when they're developing their ideas and attitudes about women and about relationships, and it's really challenging.
And surely that normalises that really bad, violent, misogynistic behaviour that they're seeing. That becomes the thing that is presumably the accepted norm, isn't it?
Absolutely, it normalises it. It normalises it, and that gives me real concern for the future about having a society that normalises and tolerates this. So we do need to act.
And there have been calls even today in response to your comments to regulate violent and misogynistic online content. What do you say to that with your hat on of extraordinary amount of legal experience? Is that even possible in the frame of a global debate right now about the online space?
It's very challenging, and I think there are a few different things we can be doing. The work of the E-Safety Commissioner is extremely important here, and she's doing very important work, as we've heard in the last couple of weeks, about removing really extreme content, violent content. So that's one part of the discussion. But the E-Safety Commissioner is also doing really important work about age verification for violent pornography, and so that's a conversation we could be having. And then more generally, we just should all be having conversations about how do we support young people, particularly boys, to navigate the environment. Given the environment that we have at the moment, we need to help them navigate that.
So how do we do that? What are the supports that you think should be put in place there? And in terms of the age verification, is that really about having a cap on the types of material you can see depending on what your age is? How do you avoid people getting around that?
In terms of the education, this needs to be happening from an early age, talking about respect and respectful relationships. And then as young people get older, we can start to have those more nuanced conversations that are age appropriate about that online space. And that needs to be happening in schools and in our homes, as well as in the broader community. So that's one thing we all need to be doing. And then in terms of age verification, I would encourage everyone to start having conversations about the work of the E-Safety Commissioner in that space, because she has done a lot of important work.
Yeah, and just today we've seen my colleague here at the ABC, Bridget Brennan, using the platform on Insiders to call out the behaviour of the media and saying that we need journalists to start asking questions in every single press conference and really own the discussion around this, saying also, if we get a breaking news alert for terrorism incidents, there's a legitimate discussion about the way that we label these incidents. What do you say to that and the broader comments about the role of the media?
Media play a crucial role here, and I think there are a number of things the media could be trying to do better. One is just reporting about this more. So we are seeing that increasingly, that it's being taken seriously. So I hope that continues, that media continues to report about domestic and family violence, to highlight it as a critical issue in our society. But how they report it really matters, and in particular the language matters. So what we need to see is the media using language that doesn't victim blame. That's really important. We often see headlines in the media that sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, put the blame on the victim, who's often a woman, and we see that increasingly. So I would really encourage all media outlets to have training for all their staff about reporting on violence against women.
And we've even seen today comments about the use of gender-based violence as opposed to, as you said right at the start of this interview, violence by men. There is a real shift in language happening right here, isn't there?
Absolutely, and we've seen that right from the very top. We've seen the Prime Minister, the Attorney General, other senior leaders, male leaders, using the language of men's violence against women, and that is an important shift because that is really highlighting that this is not a women's problem. This is a problem that we all need to address, and particularly men need to step up. So that's a really important change of language because that signals an important message.
We've also seen today some criticism of politicians that one of the CEOs that we've been hearing from today saying that politicians are being censored or being very careful around language, that they need to be much more forthright and call out what is happening to send a message to the community. Commissioner, what's your view?
I do think we need to be strong with our language, and I think there's momentum in the community right now, and that's what people expect. When we see a series of tragedies like we've seen in recent weeks and months, that calls for strong language, and I think that's appropriate.
There have even been calls for there to be a royal commission into men's violence against women. What do you think of that? Is that the sort of mechanism that might shift the dial and actually create change?
We've seen calls for a royal commission in New South Wales and also for a federal royal commission. Now, that's been ruled out at the federal level. In New South Wales, the Premier has said clearly that all options are on the table. He's called a crisis meeting of Cabinet this week. I'll be addressing that meeting along with other experts in domestic and family violence. So that is something that the government is considering in New South Wales, and it's something we need to consider very carefully.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister has said that this will be on the agenda for a national cabinet with premiers and chief ministers of the territories. Commissioner, what do you think needs to happen here? Because the fact that one woman is killed every 4 days in Australia is too crippling to ignore.
Oh, we absolutely can't ignore it. We've got to act. There's already a lot of good work taking place, and what we need to do is build on that good work, accelerate the change. We need to do a lot more. And this is a really complex problem, so we need action in a range of areas. We definitely need to look at justice responses and accountability for perpetrators. There's a review of bail laws that will be taking place in New South Wales. That's important. But in addition to those justice responses, we've got to look upstream. We've got to look at early intervention, working with men to change their behaviour before they commit these acts or after they've committed them to help them reform. And crucially, that cultural change piece, that education, awareness raising. We need that cultural shift if we're going to prevent this in the long term. So we need all of those things to be happening in parallel.
And as part of that culture change, are the men calling out violence, but also misogynistic language or the way that women are referred? Is that part of this as well?
Absolutely, that's part of it. That's a key part of this. And men have a really critical role to play. As you said, calling out other men, modelling healthy relationships, modelling healthy models of masculinity, particularly to their sons. So that's a really critical piece of the puzzle, as well as that more targeted and immediate action that we also need to be doing, and making sure that women and children who are experiencing violence get the support they need. So that's critical as well, and that includes housing as well as other supports.
And New South Wales Women's Safety Commissioner Dr Hannah Tonkin, thank you so very much for joining us and your hard work. Appreciate your insights. Thank you. And if this discussion has raised any issues for you, you can get help by calling the National Sexual Assault and Family Violence Counselling Helpline on 1800-RESPECT, which is 1800-737-732. West Australian Homicide Squad detectives have charged a man with murder after the death of a 30-year-old woman in the southern Perth suburb of Warnbro on Thursday night. Police allege the 35-year-old man assaulted the victim at their shared home before setting the property alight while she was still inside. Emergency services found the woman's body in the early hours of Friday morning. Police allege the man fled the home with the victim's 3-year-old child, who was later taken to Rockingham Hospital for treatment for smoke inhalation. The South Kalgoorlie man has been charged with 1 count of murder and 1 count of criminal damage by fire. Defence Minister Richard Marles has unveiled another $100 million in Australian military support for Ukraine during his visit to the war-torn country. Among the equipment, Australia is providing 120 Bushmaster armoured vehicles and 6 howitzer artillery guns. Mr Marles says Ukraine and its allies have expressed gratitude for Australia's continuing support throughout the conflict.
We will be continuing to provide support to Ukraine as we have provided support to Ukraine prior to this package. This is just the next tranche of support. It is by no means the end. But everywhere I've gone, both here in Ukraine, yesterday in Poland, there is an enormous sense of gratitude for the role that Australia is playing, the role that we're playing as a country which is literally on the other side of the planet.
An ABC investigation has revealed how a 10-year-old boy slipped through the cracks of the Queensland child protection system, going on to become one of the state's youngest ever killers. Now there are calls for the state to rethink its party political approach to youth crime. Reporter Jemima Burt has this exclusive report.
It started with a train ride and ended with a murder. A 10-year-old runaway escaping a brutal home life. Sleeping rough in a park for the next 3 years, he slipped through the cracks of a system designed to protect him. By age 14, he became one of the youngest killers in Queensland's history. Accomplice to the murder of a teenage boy in the same park he called home.
A family has been left shattered after a teenage boy was killed in an unprovoked knife attack.
He was jumped while walking home with a group of mates by 3 other young boys.
The 2 groups were not known to each other.
And police have charged 2 teenage boys over the alleged stabbing murder of 15-year-old Angus Beaumont.
It was pure chance the 10-year-old boy, known as Cody, ended up here on his first night on a March evening in 2017. It was just steps away from a youth centre where a former neighbour worked.
Mum had even gone to prison and Dad had died, and so there wasn't people out looking for him, it was us screaming, saying we need some support for this young person.
Documents seen by the ABC reveal his arrival was the genesis of a frustrating, one-sided campaign by the Accidental Advocate to find the boy a home. The shocking timeline chronicles 3 years of systemic failures, which saw him living with criminals and drug users.
We had contacted Child Safety so many times, like tens, hundreds of times.
It would take less than a year for homelessness to turn to lawlessness. What began with survival crimes like stealing food escalated to acts of random violence. Child Safety closed his case a year before the murder, leaving him back in his mum's home, considered too unsafe for caseworkers to visit.
Child Safety kept deeming Mum willing and able to provide the support for her children. Unfortunately, we know that not to be the case.
9 months before Angus Beaumont's death, workers from this youth centre met with Child Safety bureaucrats. They warned them that without urgent intervention in the boy's case, someone was going to die.
We could actually see this coming. Myself and another colleague had gone to the department and said that exact thing.
That's excruciating for Angus Beaumont's mum to hear.
He did not deserve to die. They could have stopped them at any turn. There were so many signs.
4 years on from his death, she still hasn't cleaned out his room. The Beaumont family has been vocal in advocating for harsher youth justice laws in the Queensland Parliament. But frontline social worker Amy Mays says a hardline approach to child criminals does not work.
Other countries have a bipartisan approach. We know that's what works.
We make no apology for having some of the harshest youth justice laws in the country.
My government is determined to keep the community safe.
Nothing this government says about youth crime can hold any credibility at all.
We've got 3 decades of research on how to stop these things from happening, but we don't put them in place.
Now 19, Cody was convicted of manslaughter and was released on parole in February. What happened between that first train ride and Angus Beaumont's death has led to years of trauma on both sides of the tracks. Jemina Burt, ABC News, Brisbane.
Israeli protesters have shut down streets in Tel Aviv demanding the release of hostages and the political end of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Anger has been growing inside Israel as the Gaza war drags on for now more than 200 days, with some Israelis angry a hostage release deal still hasn't been reached. Middle East correspondent Alison Hall for Sport now. Here's Daniela and Tilly.
Fremantle is back in the AFL's top 8 after a 24-point win over the Western Bulldogs in Perth. Nat 5 finished with an equal game-high 37 disposals for the hosts. Sam Darcy booted 3 goals for the Bulldogs, but the Dockers were in control. Josh Tracy and Bailey Banfield booted 3 majors each to secure Fremantle's 14-11-95 to 10-11-71 win. The victory ends a 3-game losing streak for the home side. The Bulldogs' loss was further soured by an injury to forward Cody Waitman, who dislocated his elbow. Ladder leader Geelong remains undefeated after 7 rounds with a hard-fought 13-point victory over Carlton. The Blues trailed by 32 points midway through the final term, but rallied to cut the margin to 8. Cat star forward Jeremy Cameron kicked his 5th goal to seal the 18-10-118 to 15-15-105 triumph. There are concerns for Geelong captain Patrick Dangerfield, who came off with a hamstring injury. 3-time NRL reigning premiers Penrith held off a late fight back from North Queensland to win 26-20 in Townsville. Brian To'o scored in his 100th NRL appearance. The Cowboys surged late with 3 unanswered tries, but Penrith held on. Dylan Edwards put his claim for a New South Wales State of Origin call-up with a try and impressive defensive display, and star halfback Nathan Cleary marked his return from injury, kicking his 600th goal for Penrith. Adam Reynolds made an impressive return from injury for Brisbane, who beat the West Tigers 34-10 at Campbelltown Stadium. The Broncos captain set up tries for Jock Madden and Reece Walsh, and also impressed with the boot. Madden and Walsh finished with doubles as the Broncos moved into the top 5. Liverpool's fading title hopes in the English Premier League have been dealt another blow as West Ham rescued a 2-2 draw at London Stadium. The Reds sit 3rd in the table with 3 games remaining, 2 points behind leader Arsenal, who face Tottenham tonight. Chelsea came from 2 goals down to draw 2-2 with Aston Villa and dent Villa's top 4 aspirations. Relegation threatened. Burnley salvaged a 1-1 draw with Manchester United. Crystal Palace and Fulham also drew 1-1. Everton beat Brentford 1-0 and Sheffield United has been relegated after a 5-1 thrashing by Newcastle United. The A-League men's Premier's plate race will go down to the final game of the season. The Central Coast beat rivals Newcastle 3-1 and only need a point to seal the premiership. A draw against Adelaide United on Wednesday will be enough for the Mariners to secure the Premier's plate. Wellington is currently on top of the table after beating Macarthur FC 3-0 in their last match of the regular season, but the Phoenix are only 1 point above the Central Coast, who have a game remaining. Phoenix fans were invited onto the pitch to pose for a group photo with the team. And the Wanderers are still in the hunt for finals football after overcoming a 2-goal deficit to beat Melbourne Victory 4-3. In Super Netball, the West Coast Fever have made it 3 wins from 3 in 2024 with a 7-goal victory over the Mavericks in Melbourne. The Fever trailed the first-year expansion side by 3 goals at quarter time before the Fever surged. Janelle Fowler-Nembrod hit 50 from 50 for West Coast, including her 8,000th Super Netball career goal to steer the ladder leaders to a 69-62 win. Reigning premiers, the Adelaide Thunderbirds held off a late charge from the Sunshine Coast Lightning to win 60-56. In tennis, Rafael Nadal has reached the 3rd round of the Madrid Open with a straight sets win over Alex de Minaur. The Spaniard won 7-6, 6-3 to take revenge on the Australian, who knocked him out of the Barcelona Open 10 days previously. 5-time champion Nadal is playing on the Madrid clay for the final time in what he expects to be the last of his career. He will face Pedro Charchen next.
Let's check the weather in the capitals. For today, Brisbane, a possible shower, mostly sunny for Sydney, partly cloudy in Canberra, cloud clearing from Melbourne, partly cloudy in Hobart, in Adelaide, sunny, partly cloudy in Perth, and in Darwin, sunny with a top of 34. And that's the latest from ABC News. I'm Dan Bush. Stay with us. The Pacific is up next.
The World Health Organization (WHO) said on Friday that there was widespread misuse of antibiotics throughout the global COVID-19 pandemic that has potentially fueled the propagation of antimicrobial resistance (AMR).
The only time you'll use antibiotics when you've got a viral infection is if you had a secondary proven bacterial infection that was sensitive to those antibiotics. So in other words, they were not being used appropriately. And if you are the main harm, of course, is that if you are using antibiotics, you're increasing the likelihood of antimicrobial resistance to those particular antibiotics, so that when you do need them for your bacterial infection, they are no longer so useful.
Data was collected from some 450,000 patients admitted to hospitals for COVID-19 in 65 countries over a 3-year period between January 2020 and March 2023.
Negotiators and observers from around the world are meeting in Ottawa until April 29th to craft a treaty to stop the rapidly escalating problem of plastic pollution. Thousands of miles from the conference in Canada, Kenyans battle every day to cope with the volume of plastic waste which ends up in their country. Tackling the problem here are workers at the Pure Terra recycling plant in Nairobi.
Being the only company around this Danona area, we realized we cannot be able to sort out all the plastic that are coming in. So from the good thing that is happening in Canada, we are expecting one thing, that they will come up with a policy that will help us to be able, 100% of the plastic that is being produced will also be recycled 100%.
175 nations committed to make the first legally binding treaty on plastics pollution by the end of 2024. The conference in Canada is the 4th session of the negotiating committee, INC.
Our collective responsibility and duty in this INC process is to deliver a treaty that reflects the urgency of ending plastic pollution crisis and that meets the expectations of citizens in all of our countries calling for a change.
Negotiators must streamline the existing treaty draft and decide its scope, for example, whether it will focus on human health and the environment. Osiris Karanja, who leads on issues on the environment for consultancy, lays down what he believes are priorities.
Again, we would want to see a focus on issues such as scaling of solutions for reuse and recycling and refill. Additionally, we would also want to see elimination of problematic chemicals that go into plastic production. Given a lot of these chemicals are based on petrochemicals, they're closely linked to the production of oil. So we want to see a shift towards more environmentally friendly.
Global production of primary plastic is forecast to reach 1,100 million tons by 2050 if historic growth trends continue, according to the UN.
Get all the international and African news on africanews.com. Get all the international and African news on africanews.com.
Residents stand watching as rescue workers wade out into the floodwaters to help people trapped in their homes. As Kenya's meteorological department forecasts more heavy rainfall this week, the number of people impacted by the above-average March to May rains continues to rise.
As you see behind me, there are so many houses marooned by waters and people are trapped inside. So we came with a trained team in Aqua Search and Rescue with a rubber boat with the engine to negotiate those obstacle areas and try to extract the people trapped inside.
It's estimated that flooding has affected over 100,000 people, destroyed crops and damaged infrastructure, schools, homes and small businesses, including in the capital Nairobi. People living in flood-prone areas have been advised to move to higher ground. The floods have ruined our farms. I farmed about 3 acres of land. All my crops have been destroyed. I will not harvest anything. Other people's farms have also been ruined. We're hungry. The government should help us. The United Nations says that since mid-March, at least 35 people have died in flooding events. Government-led relief efforts are ongoing across all counties with support from humanitarian partners.
Hundreds of people demonstrated on Sunday in northern Niger, calling for the immediate departure of their 1,000 American troops based there. The demos happen even as the US say it will begin plans to withdraw troops from Niger. A US official say there was no timeline for withdrawal, besides talks set to start in the coming days about next steps. Niger plays a central role in the US military's operation in Africa's Sahel region, an area on the edge of the Sahara Desert. Washington is concerned about the spread of jihadi violence, where local groups have pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State groups. Niger is home to a major US airbase in the city of Agadez, about 920 kilometers from the capital Niamey, using it for manned and unmanned surveillance flights and other operations. The US has also invested hundreds of millions of dollars in training Niger's military since it began operations there in 2013.
This group of environmental activists gathered at the Muizenberg beach in Cape Town on Monday to do a cleanup in celebration of Earth Day. The activists started at the Muizenberg beach front and cleaned along the shore and then moved to cleaning between the rocks. This woman, Linnea Trott, was the organizer.
The importance of Earth Day for me is to end in South Africa is to reduce the production of plastics by 2040 by 60%.
Earth Day is a globally celebrated annual event which mobilizes people to reduce plastic consumption and pollution around the world. The activists here pledge to keep appealing to their government and to regularly arrange beach cleanups.
They need to reduce the production of plastics. That's number one. That's where it starts. A lot of corporates need to get involved and also do their part, and also educate people about the use of single-use plastics and what other options there are as well.
South Africa stands out with the highest rate of plastic waste generation in Africa, averaging 28 kilograms per person annually, contrasting with the continent's average of 16 kilograms per person per year. The government has said it will advocate for banning single-use plastics and creating a global fund to combat plastic pollution.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Goodman. Have a good life.